Hey guys, Calen and Christine here from White and Revery. As most of y'all know, we are wedding filmmakers and we have been shooting on the Sony a7S for over 2 years now. And we wanted to make a video and share with you guys why we are switching to the Panasonic GH5 for filming weddings. Check out these clips. So just a quick disclaimer, we are not hating on Sony at all. We are just going to be discussing the GH5 and why we feel like it is a great camera for wedding filmmakers.
So if you follow us on social media, specifically Instagram and Facebook, you might have noticed that we asked for some feedback, specifically asking for what questions you guys have about this camera. We got a ton of feedback, overwhelming,
Yeah, it's great.
and which is awesome. Thank you guys for being so interactive, and we're just going to go over a lot of those things that you guys are asking. So hopefully it's helpful.
Awesome, so go ahead and let us know what topics we're going to be discussing in this video.
All right, so we're going to go over profile settings, camera capabilities, ergonomics and gear, and then things we wish we knew before we were running around filming on this thing. So let's get started.
All right, so first topic, profile settings.
A lot of people ask what our camera settings were, like what we were using while we were filming.
So we actually shot the full wedding with 3 GH5s. We rented 2 and we owned 1 at the time. So we actually shot everything on Cinelite D, and the reason for that is because we couldn't get vlog on all 3 cameras in time for this wedding. So we shot Cinelite D, absolutely loved it. It still had a lot of great dynamic range and everything on it, but the vlog would have been ideal. It has some great quality to it, but I also know that vlog is really at its best when it's shot in 10-bit. So we shot most things in 8-bit though.
And that leads us into the next question. What are our thoughts on 10-bit?
So 10-bit is awesome, especially if you're shooting vlog. But we personally, our style of filmmaking, we like to shoot in slow motion for certain shots and everything in the wedding, which means we're shooting at 4K 60 frames per second, which we love that feature on this camera. The thing is though, it's only 8-bit. So right now we shot most of the wedding in 8-bit. We did not shoot too much in 10-bit, but we have tested it and we do love it. We will probably, if Panasonic makes an update to 4K 60 frames in 10-bit, we will obviously be taking advantage of that. The amount of dynamic range you get from it is phenomenal. So we've had issues with Sony with banding and some other things like that. If we try to push the colors too much, it doesn't retain it very well. With the Panasonic, you can push those colors a lot harder and they don't fall apart. So that is definitely one thing that we loved about the GH5 against the Sony.
Yeah, so a lot of people also asked about the file size. How big are these files?
So the file size is a lot bigger than we anticipated. We currently shoot about 100 gigs on average for each wedding with the Sony cameras. When we shot with the GH5, we were surprised at how large that was. So we shot over 400 gigs for this wedding in New York that we filmed a couple weeks back.
Thank God we had the space on.
Yeah, so we had the space, we had enough cards, but we just didn't realize we would need to use all of that. Yeah. So, I mean, when you're shooting in the MOV or MP4 codec, you will be taking up at least 100 megabytes to 150 megabytes per second of data, which definitely adds up. On the Sony, it was 50 max for me. So that was one thing that we wish we knew beforehand, is how much file size. So recommend definitely getting 128 gig cards for the weddings instead of 64.
Definitely. So the next thing we really want to talk about is camera capabilities and color. A lot of people asked about the Sony and the GH5 differences and how to keep them consistent if you're using both cameras. So totally. What are your thoughts on that?
So we originally came from Canon to Sony. Canon had a lot of great colors just right out of the camera. Sony was a little bit more desaturated, but you had a lot more control over skin tones and things in post. You can push the colors a lot better. When we went to the GH5, instantly the thing that we recognized with like color-wise was that we felt that the greens and the oranges were a lot more saturated, and I felt like they were a little bit harsher. So those are some 2 things that we will be dialing back in post, and then we would I guess saturate more of the Sony image to kind of get them a lot similar. So that's one thing that I feel like you can tell it's a GH5 shot. If you can see the oranges and the greens, they just pop a little bit differently than Sony. We
also got a not very surprising amount of people asking about the low light. So
low light shots. All right. So this comes down. This is one of the things, obviously, that Sony is better at. Obviously, everyone knows Sony's low light capabilities are way better than GH5. But can the GH5 hang at wedding receptions? So this is personal preference, and this is what we've learned. So just take that with a grain of salt. When we shoot with the GH5, after looking through all the footage, we feel that the lens will really dictate how much that you can actually push in low light. So we didn't go over 3200 ISO on the GH5. We felt like once you went over 3200, the colors just fell apart. They didn't look good on skin, but everything below that looked really well. So if you're also shooting with fast glass, like an f2 or lower, I mean, you're getting a lot of light into that camera. When we're shooting on Sony, we're rarely going over 3200 anyway, unless we really need to push it, but it's on a rare occasion where we're pushing it. The only reason why we'd push it is if we have glass that's like an f4 or something. But faster glass on the GH5 and 3200 is totally fine in our personal opinion for receptions.
Yeah. I mean, also we're using lights when we're filming receptions.
Yeah.
So we're like spotlighting things and making sure that everything is really well lit in the first place. So
we shot pretty much ISO 800 for most of the reception, to be completely honest. So, but that again is personal preference. If you shoot in environments that don't have the ability to lighting a sequence, or you just love to shoot low light all the time, then stick with Sony. Don't go to GH5.
Or if it really makes you nervous, if you switch over to the GH5, maybe just have your Sony in your bag and have it as a backup. But in our case, we use lighting anyway, and it makes everything so beautiful. And I don't know. Yeah,
so I think it works fine in low light.
Yeah, it's fine. So the next thing is autofocus worth using?
No. You've probably seen a lot of tests online. Currently, the autofocus on here with native lenses that have autofocus features on it, it searches a little bit too much. It doesn't really, it's not reliable in our personal opinion. The best autofocus system we've ever used on a DSLR is the Samsung NX1. It's amazing autofocus system. It's even better than Sony in our personal opinion. If you shoot on a gimbal a lot and you want to have that focus feature, then I probably wouldn't recommend the GH5 for that if that's a big part of your filmmaking style. Us currently, we don't shoot autofocus. We've never have really. Everything's been manual. So if you see our films, everything's manual focused. So it's not a big issue for us. That would definitely be something where the Sony is better at and excels at compared to the GH5.
All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about, full frame and crop sensor.
So that is the big debate. I feel like Sony's advantage is full frame and low light capabilities compared to the GH5. Now, whenever you are talking about your full frame versus crop sensor, everyone has their hesitancy about Micro Four Thirds. It is a 2 crop compared to full frame, so the lens choices definitely have to change in order to create the same focal ranges. Now, with just understanding the math, you can get the same shallow depth of field, you can get pretty much the same look as a full frame, but you have to change a few different settings. So for instance, if you're shooting full frame on a 35 millimeter, okay, and you want to shoot at f2.8 and you want to have that depth of field, okay? Well, on the Micro Four Thirds, you would have to have a lens that is half that. So 17.5 millimeter lens is what you would use to have that same focal range. Now, if you shoot at 2.8 as well on the Micro Four Thirds versus full frame, the difference you're going to notice is the depth of field is going to be totally different. So you're going to have a shallower depth of field on full frame compared to Micro Four Thirds. Now, in order to adjust your settings on a Micro Four Thirds to create or simulate the same depth of field, you would change. So if you're 2.8 on a full frame, it would most likely be around a 1.4 on Micro Four Thirds to create that same depth of field. So since most of our weddings we shoot on, what did you do? So on most of our weddings, I'm shooting on 24 to 105 on the Sony almost all day. So that is an f4 lens. So I'm already not having a high shallow depth of field. But if I shoot around an f2 on the Micro Four Thirds, that is the equivalent of a 4 pretty much. So it is, I can pretty much get the same shallow depth of field. I can get the same look depending on the focal range on the Micro Four Thirds that I can on a full frame. So the only disadvantage is if you're wanting to go like an f2, you would have to use a fast glass like the Voigtlander that is about like a 0.95, but I don't recommend shooting wide open anyway on that. So you just won't, so you just won't be able to shoot extreme shallow depth of field with a micro four thirds to get the same effect that you would on full frame.
All right, so our next topic is ergonomics and gear.
Woo! Okay, so ergonomics, obviously the GH5 I feel like excels in their ergonomics. It is amazing to grip. It feels great. It's better weather sealed than the Sony a7S II. We have the a7S.
So tiny.
But the a7S II has a little bit better of a grip, but still the GH5 just feels good. Like once you hold it in your hand, it just feels really good and secure and like bulky. Like you can really grip it really well. So definitely love the ergonomics of it. Way better, in my opinion.
Way better.
Personal opinion.
Our review, way better. All right, so one of the main questions a lot of people asked about is battery life. Obviously, everyone who's using Sonys has this as a huge topic on their mind. Is there something that is better?
Shooting 20 batteries at a wedding. Just kidding. So on average, we have 2 Sonys at a wedding. We will probably go through about 10 batteries, I think.
I think so.
10 or 11 batteries. So on the GH5, we've heard it's great, so we thought, okay, it'll probably be about 6 batteries for a wedding. Well, we actually went through about 8 between 2 camera bodies. And the reason why is because we actually shot the whole wedding besides speeches and ceremony, all handheld, and we used the IBIS, which definitely takes up a lot more battery life. So if you have IBIS on, you will probably, all day, you will most likely need about, I would say 4 batteries per camera. If you're shooting without it, I would say 2 to 3. So that is just one thing to consider, is how much batteries you're gonna need if you're shooting a wedding. If you're going handheld, definitely more. If you don't and you have lockdown monopod, tripod, gimbal shots, then you can be fine with probably 2 to 3 per camera for a full wedding.
So speaking of IBIS, a lot of people asked about the internal stabilization.
It's like an IBIS syndrome.
I know, sounds like IBS. Let's just call it internal stabilization.
This camera is blowing our minds with the image stabilization built into it.
It's stupid.
It's absolutely amazing. So this is probably one of the best features on this camera that we've loved. So we rarely shoot handheld for weddings because on Sony, there's more, I guess, rolling shutter. It's not good with its motion blur. We have to have it locked down. Obviously, the a7S II has IBIS and it's a lot better, but in all reality, the GH5 is even better than that. So whenever we used IBIS, we could go handheld. Any of the motion just looks really good. We were shooting a groom getting ready and we were able to like push towards him, spin around, and it just had a nice motion to it. It didn't feel jagged. It didn't have any warping to the image. So we really loved going handheld on this. And the IBIS is awesome, especially if you want to even go further and you can engage the digital stabilization as well as the IBIS from the sensor. So you get an awesome range for that.
I mean, it's really, really that good. We really love clean shots on a wedding day. I feel like it just really represents the story a little bit better and tells it really well. And so when Calen said we were going to try to do some more handheld stuff, coming from the Sony, of course, I was like, a little hesitant. It's that good.
But it worked really great. I will say, though, we went handheld all day. After a while, your grip and your fingers are going to start hurting a little bit, even though this is great ergonomics. So we're going to be looking into a cage or something that's a little bit better for gripping if we're going to be going handheld for a full day. So it obviously depends on the story. Some things might be great for handheld. Some things might need to be more fluid and locked down depending on the story that you're telling. Yeah. So, but if you're doing handheld, this outbeats the Sony really well.
Really, really well.
One thing that we did notice and one con about the IBIS is we were actually shooting with some backlight at some point and we had IBIS turned on. We were filming some flowers and we noticed that the flare was shaking whenever the image was stable. So what we noticed is that with IBIS on, it's actually adjusting the sensor to stabilize. Well, the flare was incorrectly like flaring. So if you're going to be shooting any backlit stuff or where there's a flare showcasing on the lens, you should turn off IBIS because it will not look great, in our personal opinion. If you're constantly moving though, I feel like you can get away with it, but if you're still and you're just trying to hold it and stabilize it, you'll see the flare kind of shaking a little bit. So just keep that in mind if you are shooting backlit.
This is another pretty big topic coming from the Sonys where the screen is really bad. I mean, it's just awful. Some people were asking about the screen and the menu system on the GH5. So
it is phenomenal. I mean, so the screen itself on the GH5 is better has better clarity in our opinion compared to Sony. Sony just has a flip out only option and your screen is always exposed. So we've actually had some marks and blemishes that are happening to the side of the screen. You can obviously lock the screen and then flip it out. And this allowed us to get a lot of different angles that we usually don't. So obviously you can shoot like this, just like you were with Sony, but now we can also shoot really high and point it down while we're looking, which we haven't been able to get shots like that before. And it's touchscreen, which is awesome. So we're able to like move things and change things around for the screen has been great. So
screen is amazing. So while we're on this topic, a lot of people asked us if we were going to be keeping our external monitors, and the answer is yes. We love those things. It's beautiful, it's clean and crisp. And we can actually load things like LUTs and color grades onto the screen. So when we're filming it, everything just looks beautiful. There's something really satisfying about seeing what the end result may look like as you're filming it.
So we have the Small HD 501 and it is awesome. So it's 5 inches wide, so we get a bigger image. Honestly, the GH5 screen is still great though, so if you don't have external monitor, don't fret, but if you do have it, I would still highly recommend using it. It's awesome. It's got some great features to it. So it's not a necessity for an upgrade with the external monitor, but it's definitely a plus.
Definitely a plus. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about are lenses and speed boosters.
All right, this is another huge topic, lenses. What do you do? Now this is our personal opinion, just throwing that out there, so disclaimer. And it also comes with the background of the lenses that we currently have with our Sony. So if you are coming from Sony to the GH5, most people will have Canon glass. Now, just remember that your focal ranges change when you're going to a micro four thirds, so keep that in mind if you're deciding to keep the lenses you currently have. The lenses that we have that are Canon mount are the 24-105 f4, the Canon 135 f2, and then the Sigma 35 1.4. Now, out of those lenses, if we were to adapt them to the GH5, the 24-105 would not be a good choice. Reason for it is because it's not fast enough. The glass is f4. I'm not going to get any shallow depth of field that I really enjoy. The 35 would be great, but it will also look like a 70 millimeter. And then your 135 is going to be really thrown out there with like a 270 or something like that. So we're not going to be using a 270. So out of that, our decision was we want to go with native glass because we currently don't have a lot of Canon glass that we feel would adapt well to this. So as we were considering the lenses to go with this camera, we did a lot of research. Our favorite video review that helped us make this decision is from Shane Hurlbut. He did a whole review on 3 different lens choices with the GH4 over a year ago, and he talked about the lenses, how they look, how they hold up in different lighting situations and stuff. So he tested out the Leica glass, he tested out the Voigtlanders, and he tested out the Olympus. So out of that, he actually loved the Voigtlander lenses the most. So the Leica glass is great glass as well. It's a little bit more expensive than the Voigtlanders, but it's nice and sharp. But what he said about the Voigtlanders, which was what we're using and what we loved, is because it has this creamy, like soft contrast look. The skin tone's a lot softer, the way the lens displays the image or takes in the light. So we actually wanted to go with that after looking through all the tests, and we noticed also that it's one of the fastest glass at a 0.95 f-stop. Just because it's very fast doesn't mean you need to use it wide open. It falls apart whenever you open up a lot more wide. So if you're shooting at 0.95 on the Voigtlanders, you're going to have more of like a magenta cast. Things are going to look softer, so that's something to keep in mind. So the glass that he tested out was the Voigtlanders, and he said that f2 to 2.5 was like the prime spot for that lens. And what that meant is that the skin tones were great, color contrast was good, everything looked solid there. Now, with the focal ranges and the different lenses we decided to go with after doing a lot of research, on full frame, we love the 35 millimeter focal range. So with that said, micro four thirds, that means we would need a 17.5 lens. So we purchased the Voigtlander 17.5, which is a 0.95, and we absolutely love that lens. Also, he tested out the 42.5, and that's about an 85 equivalent on a full frame. And we love those 2 ranges. So 17.5, 42.5, and then we also wanted a wide lens that we could get. Well, Voigtlander makes a 10 millimeter 0.95, which is crazy, but it's also a lot more expensive than we wanted to pay for. So we did some more research, and we found the SLR Magic 10 millimeter, which is a 2.1. And it actually did really well. It was right around the price range of the Voigtlanders that we got as well. So all those camera lenses are probably between $700 and $900. So we shot the whole wedding pretty much with 3 lenses. We had the 17.5, 42.5, and then the 10 millimeter. And that got us a pretty good range of everything. Now, speed boosters. If you need more light and if you have some great Canon glass, I highly recommend staying with getting a speed booster for it. We're also thinking price though, and whenever we upgrade to the GH5, we're gonna have 2 GH5s. Well, if we're getting speed boosters for both of those cameras, I mean, you're over $1,000 now just for an adapter. But the best lens that we've heard that people love with the GH5 is the Sigma 18 to 35. I think it's like a 1.8, and especially if you have a speed booster, what that allows you to do is get even more shallow depth of field and get a little bit more light in there. So that is, if whatever you're considering, if you have Canon glass that you love that looks great on a Micro Four Thirds, stick with that. If you are considering native glass, the Voigtlanders and Leica are the best in our personal opinion. We don't have any zooms, which I know a zoom is a great option to have. So it depends on the style of filming that you like to do. With our weddings, those focal ranges we loved. It's our personal preference. Take it with a grain of salt. If you have comments or questions about other lenses or anything like that, leave them in the comments section and we can discuss it further. So
yeah. So now let's talk about cards.
Yeah, so cards is another big thing. Because we have all this data being written to the card, we need fast cards to be able to hold up to it. So we went with SanDisk, and it had the 280 megabytes option. So we recommend that card for sure, but it's only at 64 gigs, I believe. Also, Delkin is another good brand that we tried out that has 128 gigs. And that was awesome. It's also fast. So one thing we noticed is that we did use the 95 megabyte option on SanDisk as well, and it worked most of the time. So that's something to keep in mind. At times, what we noticed is that if the card couldn't write fast enough, it would stop and say, can't write fast enough. Well, we would just push record again, and then it might not happen again. So it just randomly happened throughout the day. So keep that in mind if you're shooting with a SanDisk or a card that's around 90, 95 megabytes in speed.
That was a nightmare, honestly.
Yeah.
It felt like everything was being slowed down. You want to be able to catch things really quickly. And
so even one thing we noticed is when we push stop, it would take another 3 seconds to stop. So the slower the card, it's actually slower to like complete the file, I guess. So there's moments whenever we had to wait 3 seconds to record, and that was not helpful, and we did not like that.
It was a nightmare.
So definitely get a fast card. I believe Delkin, we haven't had any issues yet. We've only used it a little bit though. So Delkin has some really great ones, and then SanDisk is a trusty brand with their 280 and 300 megabyte option.
Yeah. Now let's talk about gimbals.
Gimbals. Okay, so we usually use the Ronin, and one thing that we're trying to do is minimize our setup. So that's one thing that we love about the GH5 is that we can minimize the gear that we travel with, since we travel a lot, also the weight capabilities. With shooting this, I decided to go with a pistol grip option because one thing that I love is being able to flip out the screen and then putting it on a gimbal that I can actually look at the screen instead of having to like try to find it behind the pistol grip. So we tested out the Pilot Fly H2, which we really liked. There's some functions on it that weren't ideal, but for the most part, it held up really well. We can get in tight spots, and we can flip the screen out to the left side. Some of the gimbals are only options are on the left side, which like I guess ruins the option of pulling out the swivel screen. So getting one that can switch over to right is great. Also, the payload on this with the Voigtlanders is roughly, it's a little under 3 pounds, so making sure that the gimbal can hold that. So we're probably going to be doing a review with the Pilot Fly H2 and how we set it up, and some things that we're going to be adjusting to it to make it work for weddings.
So the next thing we're going to talk about, things we wish we knew before showing up on a wedding day with these cameras. So luckily the list is very small, but they're pretty important things. So you want to jump in?
Yeah, so one of the things was card size. We already discussed that. Be prepared for 300 to 400 gigs of content if you're filming a full day wedding.
The next thing is battery life.
Yes.
When you're using IBIS, we came in confidently saying, oh, these batteries are so much better than the Sonys, but then we had all this stabilization going and it really ran the battery life down. So
And then also there's another function called Expand ISO, which allows you to drop your ISO options down to 100. We're like, oh, this is great, we're expanding ISO. So one thing that we noticed is that whenever we turned that on and we filmed, certain highlights were not rolling off nicely and they were clipping a lot harder and a lot quicker. It limits your dynamic range with the highlights in particular. So definitely keep that turned off and shoot with 200 in its actual range, and you will have a better result. So let's talk about some of the features that we absolutely loved about the GH5 after using it filming a wedding. There are some really cool functions in this camera that are awesome, especially for weddings. One of our favorite features, besides the IBIS, which is amazing, is the X teleconverter. Now what that is that I believe crops in, if you're shooting in 4K, it will actually, if you turn that on, it'll crop your image, I think by 1.4. So you can actually get like that, a little bit more of a zoom reach with a prime lens if you're using. You can just kind of bump in a little bit more. That was phenomenal, especially for ceremonies. So if you're shooting in 1080, and if you turn the telex converter on, it will actually crop in, I believe, 2.7 times. So you can imagine if we're shooting with a 42.5, which is equivalent to an 85, once you turn on that crop 2.7, I mean, you're about a 200 pretty much. So it is a great feature to extend the range of your lenses, was the X teleconverter. Love that feature.
Another cool feature is focus peaking. So if you're coming from Sony, you're probably used to zooming in while you're filming to double check, triple check as many times as possible on that focus to make sure everything is great. And I didn't for a second wish that I had that on the GH5 because the focus peaking was that good. So that's not something I'm gonna miss at all.
So another feature that we love on the GH5 compared to Sony is obviously the menu system. Everyone hates the menu system on Sony, I totally understand. The GH5 is phenomenal. You can also set your own custom menu with all your favorite settings right there in one window, and it is great. So we've put all of our favorite settings easily accessible in one location.
And tell them about how we had multiple cameras and it was just the easiest thing.
Oh yeah, so whenever we rented 2 extra GH5s for the wedding, we changed all of our settings on our camera to our liking, and then we just saved the preset of all those settings and just implemented them into the other 2 GH5s, and instantly all our cameras had the same setting.
It was amazing.
It was awesome, super quick. Haven't been able to do that with Sony. One thing though we did notice that didn't carry over in that saved setting is we've actually switched our shutter and f-stop scroll wheels because we came from Canon. We kept the same feel on Sony, so also coming here we have our top index finger scroll wheel to be shutter, and we have our back one to be f-stop. So we switched that, and that did not carry over whenever we loaded the preset. So that's one thing we didn't notice. Yeah, it's the one thing they didn't load.
Honestly, if you're hiring like a second shooter, like that's like amazing.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. So you can just load everything up.
It's amazing.
Another awesome feature is if you're wanting to set a custom button, what you can do the really quick way is you can just hold down that button for 2 to 3 seconds and instantly lets you choose what you want that function to be. So that was really neat. Also, the biggest feature on this camera and why we upgraded is obviously 4K in slow motion, 60 frames per second. So that was absolutely phenomenal. We've always wanted to be able to upgrade. We haven't upgraded from the A7S until there was a DSLR or mirrorless camera that could do that. GH5 is the one that does that currently. So love that.
Yes. So you want to recap?
Let's recap.
Recap the pros and cons. Let's go over the pros first. So
the pros are 4K 60 frames per second. The 1080, 180 frames per second is still gorgeous. Love that feature. Also, the 10-bit option is wonderful. The image stabilization on this camera is remarkable.
Focus peaking.
Focus peaking is awesome. You can always stay in focus, never have an issue.
X teleconverter.
X teleconverter feature is kind of equivalent to that APS-C crop mode in Sony where you crop in a little bit. It's not as much as a crop, but it is nice to have that feature without losing any resolution on the GH5.
Ergonomics.
Ergonomics, you can hold this way better than Sony, and it feels good in your hands.
Feels real good. The menu system.
Menu system, obviously anything's better than Sony.
And the battery life.
Battery life is not as amazing as you'd hope to, but it's not as bad as Sony, so it's like a lot, it's just better.
And last but not least, it's cheaper.
Yes, so right now the GH5 you can get for $2,000, the A7S II, $2,500 bucks. So if you're upgrading like we will be, we're gonna have to buy 2 cameras. So whenever you add that up, you're saving about $1,000. You can put that into glass and stuff like that.
Yeah, and if we're gonna talk about the pros, we also need to talk about the cons.
Cons, so low light is not as phenomenal as the A7S.
Yes.
You would have to counter that with faster glass and just possibly lighting a little bit more in the ceremony or in the reception.
And also shallow depth of field.
Shallow depth of field, you just have to understand the math, and you have to get faster glass to create that same look that you would with a full frame, and then just take into consideration the focal range with the crop sensor.
And this isn't relevant to us, but also autofocus.
Autofocus is not great on this camera, and it's not usable in our opinion. So if you rely on autofocus and you require low light, you should totally stick with Sony. That's probably a better camera choice for you. If those 2 issues are not as important to you, and you really care about 4K at 60 frames or all these other features that we've said, I would definitely consider the GH5 and upgrade to that. So another thing a lot of people have asked us is, why don't we just wait out for Sony to release their 4K 60 frames mirrorless camera? So we've thought about it long and hard, and we feel that the things that they lack in would not make up for that one feature, because the GH5 covers a lot more areas and a lot of different features that the Sony currently doesn't have. So I feel like Sony, even though they would update to a 4K 60 frame option, I feel like their battery life will still not improve. Their ergonomics might improve a little bit better. The image stabilization, I don't think will get as good as the GH5. Plus all the screen, they would have to really update the screen. I feel like there has to be so many improvements for Sony to make it worth it to match the GH5 with all those small features. Yes, the Sony is better in low light. Yes, it's better because it's full frame for shallow depth of field. Honestly, those are the only 2 things that we feel Sony improves on than the GH5. Personal opinion though. Also, we feel that Panasonic seems to be listening to their consumer base a lot more and making constant improvements, where I feel like Sony's been kind of taking their time a little bit and it's been lacking in a few areas. So all this, take it with a grain of salt though. Pick the camera body or the lenses based off of the type of story you're gonna tell, the style of shooting that you like to do, and the features that both cameras offer. We are gonna be upgrading to the GH5 because of all those features that we've talked about. Honestly, low light isn't an issue for us with our style of shooting, and also full frame, shallow depth of field, we can get very close to that same look with just faster glass and changing our focal range. So those are the reasons why we're upgrading to the GH5 and why we think it's an amazing camera for wedding filmmakers.
We hope this was really helpful for you guys. Again, we don't claim to be experts on the GH5. We've just used them and have a lot of thoughts on them. So if you have any questions or comments or advice for us as we continue this journey, be sure to leave them in the comments below. We'd love it.
And we will be posting the links to the GH5 and the lenses that we chose and everything like that. So if you want to check that out, we're going to have that in the description. So there you go.
And as always, please subscribe.